A racist police officer spits on a black veteran and arrests him. He is shocked to discover who the black veteran's son is. Charlie Green stepped into the diner, his worn olive green coat buttoned up tight. The place was quiet, nearly empty, save for a couple of folks sipping coffee and a waitress leaning against the counter with a newspaper. He gave her a nod and settled at a small corner table by the window, placing his hands on the table and glancing at his watch. His son, Marcus, was running late, but he didn't mind. He'd always been good at waiting. He felt the stares. Just a few quick glances, but enough to remind him where he was. A mostly white diner in a neighborhood he rarely visited, but he brushed it off. Just another day, he thought. Another cup of coffee in another town. He signaled the waitress, who approached with a neutral expression. "Just a coffee, please," he said, giving her a polite smile. She nodded and poured him a cup without a word. Charlie wrapped his hands around the mug, enjoying its warmth as he took in the scene. He heard the chime of the door, and a glance over his shoulder told him someone new had entered. A police officer, tall and broad, with a face that seemed perpetually scowling. The officer's gaze swept the room and landed on Charlie. He didn't look away. Instead, he walked over, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. Stopping by Charlie's table, he crossed his arms, casting a shadow over Charlie's coffee. "You lost or something?" the officer asked, his voice carrying an edge. Charlie looked up, his face calm. "Just waiting for my son," he replied evenly, as if it were a routine question. But he knew better. He'd heard that tone too many times before. The officer's brow furrowed. "Your son, huh?" He gave a dismissive snort, glancing around the diner. "Don't see too many folks like you around here. How long you plan on waiting?" Charlie raised his coffee to his lips, sipping slowly before answering. "As long as it takes, officer." The officer scoffed, his lips curling in a smirk. "This isn't the place for loitering. People get nervous, you know." Charlie kept his gaze steady. "I'm not here to bother anyone, just having coffee." The officer leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "Let me see some ID, old man." Charlie met his eyes, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his veteran ID and handing it over without a word. He watched as the officer took it, barely glancing at it before tossing it back onto the table with a sneer. "A vet? Not sure I'm buying it," the officer said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "You think some ID's enough to make you belong here?" Charlie didn't flinch. "Believe it or don't, I know who I am." The officer let out a harsh laugh, loud enough to draw a few looks from the other patrons. "Yeah, and I know the type, acting all polite, pretending you're somebody." Charlie's patience wavered for just a second, but he kept his tone calm. "You got a problem with me, officer?" The officer leaned in even closer, his voice now a harsh whisper. "Problem? My problem is folks like you thinking you can walk in wherever you want, thinking you're entitled to respect. You're out of place, and I don't take kindly to people like you pushing their luck." Charlie felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I'm just a man having coffee," he said quietly, "not looking for trouble." "Trouble finds you, though, doesn't it?" the officer sneered. "Maybe it's time you left, before I make it official." Charlie took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the mug. He could feel the weight of the officer's stare, the simmering hostility in his words. He glanced at his watch, wondering how much longer his son would be. "Maybe I'll wait right here," Charlie said finally, his tone steady. The officer's expression darkened. "Suit yourself, old man. Just know I'll be watching." Charlie's hand tightened around the table's edge as Stark loomed over him, the officer's face inches from his own, eyes narrowed and full of disdain. "I told you once, old man. I don't want to tell you again." Stark's voice was cold, the words coated in scorn. "You're not wanted here. People like you think you can just stroll in, sit wherever you please, like you belong." Charlie looked up at him, his expression calm but with a flicker of defiance in his gaze. "I'm here, waiting for my son. I've got just as much right as anyone else to sit here and have a coffee." Stark let out a bitter laugh. "A right?" He leaned forward, his face twisting with a mocking grin. "Rights are for people who actually earn them, not some washed-up old man with a fake ID." "It's not fake," Charlie replied, his voice steely. "I earned that ID and the title on it, same as any other veteran." "Sure you did. Stark sneered. Guys like you always got a story, don't you? Always talking about how hard you had it, what you earned. He looked down his nose at Charlie. Well, maybe you haven't earned anything except a one-way ticket out of here. Charlie's voice grew firmer. I served this country with respect, and I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came for a quiet cup of coffee. Quiet? Stark laughed harshly, his voice echoing around the diner. Oh, I think you're making quite a bit of noise just sitting here, looking like you don't belong. He reached over, shoving Charlie's coffee mug across the table with a rough flick of his hand. The mug teetered before tipping over, spilling its contents onto Charlie's coat and dripping onto the floor. Charlie drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, but Stark leaned closer, a sneer pulling at his lips. You're making this place look bad. You know that? A place like this doesn't need your kind dragging it down, Stark said, his voice loud enough that nearby patrons were casting nervous glances their way. Charlie met his eyes, his voice low but resolute. I'm not going anywhere, officer. I'll leave when my son gets here, not because you're throwing a fit. A fit? Stark spat the words, his tone darkening. You don't get to talk to me like that, old man. I'm the law here. You don't just sit around disrespecting me like you think you're untouchable. Respect has to be earned, Charlie said, his tone razor-sharp, unwavering. Stark's face twisted in fury. Earned? You're telling me about earning respect? Coming in here, acting all high and mighty with your so-called veteran status, you think that makes you better than everyone else? I think it means I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else, Charlie replied calmly. Stark's eyes flashed. Oh, you deserve something, all right. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with contempt. People like you, acting like you're above the rules, like you're something special. I don't think I'm special, Charlie replied, the patience in his voice waning. But I know my rights, and I know that sitting here, having a coffee, isn't hurting anyone. Stark's lips curled into a sneer, and without warning, he leaned forward and spat, the glob landing on Charlie's coat. For a split second, the room froze as the onlookers gasped, and even the waitress took a step back, shocked. Charlie's jaw clenched, his hands tightening on the table, but he didn't move, his gaze unwavering as he stared up at Stark. Disgusting, isn't it? Stark taunted, a mocking smile spreading across his face. That's what you are. Something to be spat on, something that doesn't belong. Charlie took a deep, steadying breath. Is that what you think? That you're better because of that badge on your chest? Stark's grin widened. It's not the badge, old man. It's what I represent. Order, control, things you people don't understand. And I'm telling you, right now, to get up and leave. Or I'll drag you out myself. Charlie's voice was barely above a whisper, but his words were clear. I've faced worse than you, officer, and I'm not moving. Stark's expression darkened, and he placed a hand on Charlie's shoulder, squeezing it hard, but Charlie didn't flinch. You're making a mistake, Stark hissed. You want to talk about respect? Well, respect means listening to authority, means knowing when to back down. Authority doesn't mean a right to abuse people, Charlie said, his voice growing firmer, each word pronounced with precision. And if you think pushing me around makes you stronger, then you don't understand respect. Stark's face contorted with anger, and without warning, he shoved the table, sending it clattering sideways. Charlie's chair rocked, and he barely caught himself before he tumbled to the floor. The officer's face was red now, his breathing harsh. He reached down, grabbed Charlie's shoulder, and pulled him to his feet. I told you to leave, he shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. You don't belong here, and I don't want to see you again. Got it? Charlie steadied himself, his voice calm but laced with iron. I don't answer to people like you. I answer to my own principles, and I'm not backing down. Stark's eyes glinted with rage, and he shoved Charlie backward. All right, tough guy. Let's see how brave you are in a cell. He yanked Charlie's arms behind him, roughly snapping on handcuffs as the onlookers watched, stunned into silence. You think you're above the law? Stark spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Well, let's see how that works out for you. Charlie's wrists strained against the cuffs, but his calm, weathered expression was beginning to crack as Stark shoved him roughly toward the squad car. The officer's smug, triumphant smirk seemed to push him closer to an edge he rarely crossed. "You think this makes you tough, don't you?" Charlie said, his voice low but laced with fury. "Think shoving an old man around? Throwing your weight around like this makes you a big man?" Stark sneered, barely glancing back. "Keep talking, old man. Won't change where you're going." Charlie let out a harsh laugh, bitterness bubbling to the surface. "Where I'm going? Boy, I've been places you couldn't survive for a minute. I've stared down men twice your size, and I didn't take half the disrespect you're showing me now." Stark stopped in his tracks, turning to face Charlie, his expression darkening. "Disrespect? You think you deserve respect?" He let out a cold laugh. "You think sitting there, acting like you're better than everyone, makes you worth a damn?" Charlie's eyes narrowed. "Better than everyone?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You want to talk about acting? Look at you, puffed up in that uniform, trying to prove something that isn't there. You're nothing but a bully and a badge." Stark's face twisted with anger, his grip tightening on Charlie's arm. "Watch it, old man. You're already in deep enough. No, you watch it," Charlie snapped, yanking his arm free despite the cuffs. "You think you're something special because you get to push people around. You think that uniform makes you invincible? That I'm supposed to cower because you've got a badge?" The officer's face turned red, his breathing quickening as Charlie's words hit home. He looked around, seeing the few patrons and bystanders watching them with horrified interest, their eyes darting nervously between him and the veteran. "Shut up," Stark growled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You're going to shut your mouth right now, or I swear, or you'll what?" Charlie interrupted, his tone fierce and unyielding. "You're already manhandling me, throwing me around like trash. What's next? You gonna beat down an old man in public because you can't handle a little truth?" Stark's face darkened, and he spat at Charlie, the glob landing on his coat with a sickening splat. "There's your truth," Stark hissed, smirking as he watched the spit slide down the fabric. Charlie looked down, his jaw clenched, and something inside him snapped. "You think that makes you powerful? You're a coward," he said, his voice seething with rage. "You think spitting on a man makes you strong? You're nothing but a disgrace to that uniform." Stark's expression faltered for just a second, his fists tightening as he struggled to keep his composure. "You don't know a damn thing about me, old man," he snarled. "You're a nobody, a washed-up relic, wasting space and making everyone else uncomfortable." "Oh, I know enough," Charlie shot back, his eyes blazing. "I know you're a scared little man, hiding behind that badge, because you'd be nothing without it. You're the kind that needs a uniform just to feel important. Aren't you?" Stark's face went crimson, and he stepped closer, his voice barely more than a hiss. "Keep talking, and I'll make sure you spend the night in a cell. I'll throw away the key if I have to." "Do it," Charlie said, his voice daring, his tone filled with contempt. "Throw me in a cell if that's all you know how to do. But remember, you're the one showing your true colors. You're the one acting like a scared, small-minded bully." Stark's lip curled, and he grabbed Charlie's shoulder roughly, shoving him toward the car. "You're done. I'm putting an end to this right now." Charlie pulled back, his eyes filled with a fire that surprised even him. "You don't get to put an end to anything," he said, voice rising with each word. "You think you're better than me? You think your badge makes you worth something? I served this country. Men like me fought and bled so you could parade around pretending to be someone." Stark yanked open the car door, practically shoving Charlie inside. "Get in the car and shut up." Charlie leaned forward, his voice still sharp, undeterred even as Stark tried to close the door on him. "I may be in cuffs, but don't think for a second I'm the one cowering. You're scared, Officer Stark. Scared of being nothing without that uniform. Scared because deep down, you know I'm right." "Shut up!" Stark barked, slamming the door with enough force that it rattled. He stormed to the driver's side, breathing hard as he climbed in, hands shaking slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. Charlie didn't look away, his gaze fixed on Stark through the rearview mirror. "You're afraid," he said, his voice piercing through the tense silence. "Afraid that one day people are going to see you for what you really are, a sad, pathetic little man who hides behind a badge." Stark glared back at him, His face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. His jaw clenched as he started the car and pulled out of the diner parking lot. In the back seat, Charlie held his head high, his heart pounding with a mixture of fury and satisfaction. He knew he'd crossed a line with Stark, but he didn't care. He wasn't about to let this man reduce him to silence. As they drove toward the police station, neither spoke, the tension thick in the air. But Charlie knew, deep down, that his words had struck a nerve Stark wouldn't soon forget. Charlie's wrists were sore from the tight cuffs as Stark shoved him into the cold, empty cell. The officer's face wore a smug smile as he swung the cell door shut, the metal slamming into place with a loud clang. The sound echoed, and for a moment, all Charlie could hear was the hollow ring of the door sealing him in. Stark stood just outside the bars, crossing his arms with that same sneer. "Bet you're feeling pretty high and mighty now, huh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "All that tough talk, and here you are, exactly where you belong." Charlie stood still, taking a slow, deep breath, letting his gaze rise to meet Stark's. "You think this makes you powerful?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but laced with a smoldering anger. "Think locking me up in here makes you a big man?" Stark's sneer only widened. "I think it reminds you who's in charge. You're nothing, old man. Just another troublemaker who thought he could walk in anywhere he wanted." Charlie's eyes narrowed. "I was sitting in a diner, waiting for my son. I didn't cause a scene. You did. But here you are, acting like some kind of hero because you got to throw around your weight." He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It's pathetic." Stark's face darkened, his posture stiffening as he gripped the bars. "Pathetic?" he spat. "You're sitting in a cell? And you've got the nerve to call me pathetic? You ought to be grateful I didn't do worse." "Worse?" Charlie's voice sharpened. "You're right. I've seen worse. I've seen it in men who thought power was something you used to hurt, to belittle, to control. They were cowards, every one of them, just like you." Stark's face reddened, his hands tightening on the bars as he struggled to keep his composure. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he hissed. "You think your service makes you special? Think you're entitled to something?" Charlie let out a hollow laugh. "Entitled? That's rich, coming from a man hiding behind his badge, because it's the only way anyone listens to him." Stark's grip on the bars tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Listen to yourself," he sneered. "You're just an old, bitter man sitting in a cell because you can't accept that your time's up. You don't belong here. Never did." Charlie's eyes held Stark's with steady defiance. "I belonged there just as much as anyone else. You made it about me, about what you think I am. And that's on you, Stark. That's your own weakness, not mine." Stark's face twisted with barely controlled rage. "You're done," he muttered, stepping back, his voice low. "Rot here and think about that." He turned on his heel and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, fading into the silence. Alone in the cell, Charlie felt the emptiness close in around him. The stark concrete walls, the cold metal bench, the harsh fluorescent lights, they all seemed designed to break a man's spirit, to remind him of his isolation, his helplessness. But Charlie refused to let it sink him. He wouldn't give Stark that satisfaction. He sat down on the hard bench, his shoulders squared, his head held high. He took a deep, steadying breath, forcing himself to focus, to keep the anger from clouding his mind. Yet, as he sat in that silence, memories began to surface. The weight of a service rifle, the cold of early mornings, the faces of men he'd fought beside, some who never made it back. He remembered why he'd served, why he'd fought, for freedom, for dignity, for respect, for the right to sit in any diner, in any town, without facing the kind of hatred Stark had thrown at him today. The anger simmered in his chest, but now it was laced with resolve. He wouldn't let Stark or anyone else make him feel small. He had fought for the right to be here, to be treated with respect. And he knew that, one way or another, the truth would come out. He'd raised a son who understood justice, who knew right from wrong. He knew that soon enough his son would arrive. And when he did, Stark would have to answer for what he'd done. In the silence of that cell, Charlie sat tall, determined, the fire in his heart undimmed. Charlie had been sitting in the cell for what felt like hours, the cold metal bench unforgiving beneath him. His patience remained steady, but a sense of anticipation grew within him. He knew Marcus would be here soon. His son would not stand for this. Outside the cell, down the corridor, a commotion broke the silence. Raised voices echoed down the hall, followed by hurried footsteps. Charlie straightened, his heart pounding as he recognized the familiar, commanding voice of his son. "What the hell is going on here?" Marcus's voice was unmistakable, carrying the weight of authority and fury. There was a pause, a shuffle of uncomfortable murmurs from the officers around him. Stark, who had been leaning by the front desk with a smug expression, looked up in shock, his face turning ashen as he realized who had arrived. He swallowed, his arrogance wavering, but he quickly tried to put on a facade of professionalism as he approached Marcus. "Captain Green, I didn't expect you to be here," Stark stammered, attempting a calm tone. Marcus's gaze fixed on Stark, ice cold, his jaw set. "Didn't expect me?" he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? You thought no one would say anything about you manhandling my father and throwing him in a cell?" Stark's face flushed, and he opened his mouth, trying to find the words. "Sir, I didn't realize he was your father. I thought that he was some random black man you could throw your weight around with." Marcus's tone was deadly. He took a step closer, his eyes blazing with barely contained rage. "You didn't even bother to look at him as a human being. You saw what you wanted to see. A man you thought you could bully, and you thought you'd get away with it." Stark's face was pale now, but he tried to regain control. "Captain, with all due respect," he was being belligerent, disrespectful. "I was keeping the peace." People at the diner were uncomfortable. "Uncomfortable?" Marcus's voice cut through the room like a blade. "The only one making people uncomfortable was you, Stark. Every witness I spoke to said my father was sitting quietly, minding his own business, until you showed up with your contempt and your fists, and instead of handling it professionally, you humiliated him. You spat on him. You threw him in a cell because you wanted to feel powerful." Stark's defiant demeanor wavered, but he forced himself to keep speaking. "Sir, I didn't know he was your father, and honestly, it wouldn't have changed anything. He was acting like he didn't belong there, and he refused to leave when I asked." Marcus's fists clenched, his knuckles white. "Didn't belong there? You think that because you wear a badge, you get to decide who belongs where? You think your position gives you the right to treat people like garbage? My father has every right to sit in any diner he wants, in any town, without being harassed by someone like you." Stark's voice shook slightly, but he tried to hold his ground. "Captain, I'm sorry if it came across that way, but I was following procedure. I was looking out for the community." "He was being uncooperative." Marcus's eyes flashed with anger. "Uncooperative? You spat on him. You shoved him. You threw him into a cell like he was some kind of animal, all because he didn't cooperate with your ego." Marcus's voice rose, each word laced with fury. "You think your badge makes you untouchable, don't you, Stark? Think you can do whatever you want and hide behind your position?" Stark's bravado crumbled, his face turning red with embarrassment and frustration. "With all due respect, Captain, he was being difficult. He acted like he was above authority." Marcus took another step closer, his face inches from Stark's. "Above authority?" he repeated, his tone deadly calm. "My father didn't act like he was above authority. He acted like a man with dignity, and you couldn't stand it, could you? You couldn't stand that he wouldn't bow down to you, that he wouldn't let you push him around." Stark looked down, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go that far." Marcus's voice softened, but the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. "You don't get to mean anything anymore, Stark. You crossed a line, and not just with him, with every person who's ever trusted you to uphold the law, to respect the badge. You've shown us all that you don't deserve it." Stark's mouth opened, his voice small and desperate. "Captain, I'm a good officer. I've been here for years. This is just one mistake." "This wasn't a mistake," Marcus interrupted, his voice fierce. "A mistake is forgetting a protocol or misfiling a report. What you did was deliberate. You abused your power. You let your prejudice guide your actions, and you humiliated a man who deserved respect. You treated him like less than human because of your own bigotry. The room was silent, as Marcus's words hung in the air, stark and heavy. Officers nearby stood quietly, their expressions a mix of discomfort and unease as they listened, avoiding Stark's gaze. Stark swallowed, his voice barely audible. So, what now? Marcus's gaze hardened. Now, you're going to take responsibility for what you've done. You're going to face a formal review, and if there's any justice in this department, you'll be out of here before the week is over. Because we don't need officers like you who treat people like dirt. Stark's face flushed with anger and humiliation, but he nodded stiffly, realizing he was out of options. Marcus took a final step back, his gaze unwavering. And if you think for a second that this is over, Marcus added, his voice cold, think again. You will answer for every action, every word. You've disgraced the badge and this department, and you don't get to walk away unscathed. Stark looked down, his face ashen, his defiance finally shattered. Marcus turned, the fury in his eyes still smoldering, and walked to the cell where his father sat, the lock clicking open. Charlie stood, meeting his son's gaze with a steady look of pride and gratitude. Without another word, Marcus led his father out, the tension in the room palpable as officers watched in silence, each one knowing that justice had begun its course. Marcus guided his father out of the station, the weight of the incident still heavy on both of them. As they reached a quiet corner outside, Marcus stopped and turned to face Charlie, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, regret, and a deep, unspoken admiration. Dad, Marcus began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. I'm sorry I didn't get there sooner, that you had to sit in that cell at all. Charlie put a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it gently. Marcus, you did right by me, he replied, his voice steady, calm. You didn't let him get away with it. That's what matters. You can't be everywhere, son, but you can set things right when it counts. Marcus's jaw tightened as he looked away, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. I can't believe he did that to you, he muttered, the anger flickering back into his expression. I knew Stark had issues, but I never imagined he'd go that far. He spat on you, Dad. Charlie's expression hardened, but he kept his voice steady. Men like him, they see power as a weapon, not a responsibility. The badge just gave him a cover, a reason to justify his anger. You can put on a uniform, but it doesn't make you honorable. Marcus's fists clenched, his shoulders tense. The way he treated you, I can't stand it, Dad. He had no right to do that to anyone, let alone someone who's given so much for this country. The way he spoke to you, it made my blood boil. I've worked my entire career to prove that officers don't have to be like that we can be better. Charlie's eyes softened, and he gave his son a reassuring nod. And you've done exactly that, Marcus. You've shown respect. And today, you showed that you won't tolerate injustice, even when it comes from within your own department. That's more powerful than anything Stark will ever understand. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted you to go through something like this, not with one of my own officers. When I put on this badge, I swore that I'd be different, that I'd make sure people like you didn't have to face this kind of treatment again. Charlie looked at his son, pride evident in his expression. You've done more than enough, Marcus. Today, you showed everyone in there that respect is earned, not demanded. I know you wanted to protect me, but don't carry this as your burden. You stood up, and that's all a father could ever ask for. The two men stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle between them. Finally, Marcus nodded, a glimmer of resolve in his eyes. Tomorrow, we'll hold the formal review, he said, his tone firm. I'm going to make sure Stark faces consequences. He has to answer for what he did. Charlie gave a small, approving nod. Then, go do what needs to be done. I have faith in you, son. They exchanged a quiet, resolute glance. The bond between them felt stronger than ever, forged not only by family, but by shared principles and the fight for justice. The following day, The conference room in the station was tense, filled with officers, senior staff, and a representative from Internal Affairs. Stark sat at one end of the table, visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair as he glanced around, his face pale and drawn. Marcus took his seat across from him, his expression impassive, but the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. The Internal Affairs representative cleared her throat, addressing the room. "We are here today to review the actions of Officer Ryan Stark regarding the incident at the diner involving Mr. Charles Green. This review will determine whether Officer Stark's actions were consistent with departmental policies and if he is fit to continue serving." Stark looked around, his defiance from the previous day gone, replaced by a nervous tension as he met Marcus's gaze. He attempted a confident tone, but his voice came out shaky. "With all due respect, I don't believe this review is necessary. I was doing my job. I followed procedure." Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with a barely controlled fury. "You followed procedure? You mean to tell us that spitting on an elderly man, roughing him up, and locking him up was your idea of procedure?" Stark's face flushed, but he forced himself to continue. "Sir, he was uncooperative, disrespectful. He refused to leave when I asked. I felt it was my duty to remove him from the premises for the safety of the other patrons." Marcus's tone grew colder. "For the safety of the patrons? You really expect us to believe that a 70-year-old man sitting quietly in a diner posed a threat to anyone? Or is it that you felt he didn't belong there?" Stark's eyes flicked to the other officers around the table, seeking some support, but all he received were stony, disapproving glares. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. I was acting on what I thought was best for the situation, Captain. I didn't know he was your father." "That's the whole point, Stark," Marcus cut him off sharply. "This isn't about him being my father. It's about the fact that you abused your power. You thought you could get away with humiliating him because he didn't fit your idea of who belongs in that diner. You didn't see him as a man. You saw him as an inconvenience, something to be controlled and disposed of." Stark's face reddened, and he glanced away, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Captain, I didn't mean to. I just thought you could treat him like dirt because no one would call you on it." Marcus interrupted, his voice low but filled with rage. "You thought no one would care, and now you're here, trying to twist it, acting like you were just doing your duty. But there's no excuse for what you did." The Internal Affairs representative leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Stark. "Officer Stark, several witnesses reported that you insulted Mr. Green, spat on him, and used excessive force without provocation. These are serious allegations, and your conduct is under intense scrutiny. Do you have anything further to say for yourself?" Stark swallowed hard, glancing between Marcus and the representative. Desperation etched across his face. "I've been a dedicated officer for years. I've given everything to this job. One mistake shouldn't ruin my career." Marcus shook his head, his voice unyielding. "This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice to use your power to demean, belittle, and punish a man who had done nothing wrong. And now you're sitting here, hoping you can talk your way out of it." Stark's defiance finally cracked, his shoulders slumping. I didn't mean for it to go that far." Marcus's gaze hardened. "Maybe you didn't mean it, but that doesn't change what you did. You betrayed the trust this community placed in you, and you showed everyone here that you're unfit to wear that badge." The room fell silent as Marcus's words settled over everyone, stark and unforgiving. The officers around the table nodded slowly, acknowledging the weight of Marcus's judgment. The Internal Affairs representative looked at Stark, her expression grave. "Officer Stark, based on the evidence presented and the testimonies provided, it is the recommendation of this review board that your employment be terminated, effective immediately." Stark's face crumpled, the reality hitting him like a blow. He looked around the room, but there was no support, no sympathy in the eyes of his colleagues. He stood slowly, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue, but the words died on his lips. With one last look of resentment, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. Marcus looked around the table, addressing the officers still seated. Let this serve as a reminder. Our badge doesn't give us the right to decide who deserves respect. It gives us the responsibility to uphold respect for everyone in our community. If anyone here thinks they're above that, they're free to join Stark on his way out. No one spoke. The only response was the respectful silence of a team that understood the gravity of Marcus's words. As Marcus rose to leave, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a bittersweet reminder that justice, while often delayed, could still be served. And as he left the conference room, he knew that his father would be proud of what he had done today. Later that evening, Marcus drove over to his father's house. The weight of the review's outcome was still fresh on his mind, but he knew he needed to share it with the man who mattered most. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Charlie sitting on the front porch, a soft glow from the porch light illuminating his calm, steady expression. Marcus felt a rush of pride for his father's resilience, but knew the news he brought would evoke more than a quiet satisfaction. Charlie looked up as Marcus approached, nodding slightly as his son sat beside him. "So?" Charlie asked, his voice low, but his tone carrying an edge of anticipation. "What did they decide about your officer?" Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face before answering. "They terminated him, Dad. Effective immediately. Internal Affairs backed it all the way. Stark won't be wearing that badge again." Charlie nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. Good. He didn't deserve to wear it in the first place. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the news settle between them. The quiet night air was cool, and the distant sounds of crickets filled the silence as Marcus gathered his thoughts. "Dad, I want you to know I meant every word I said in that review," Marcus finally said, his voice steady. "I wanted them all to understand just how far he crossed the line, how that kind of behavior has no place in our department." Charlie glanced at him, his expression unreadable, but there was a spark of gratitude in his eyes. "You stood up, son, and you made sure they knew it wasn't just a minor slip-up or a mistake, as he tried to call it. You made sure they saw the truth." Marcus's gaze dropped, his shoulders tense. "The way he treated you, Dad, it makes me sick to think someone like that could have that kind of power. To be able to throw his weight around like that, all because he didn't think you belonged in a place like that diner. He thought he was untouchable." Charlie shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "The thing is, Marcus, he isn't the first, and he won't be the last. That kind of hate, it doesn't die out just because a badge gets taken away. It's there in the assumptions, the disrespect, the way people look at you like you're in the wrong place just for sitting down to have a coffee." Marcus felt a rush of anger and helplessness rise in his chest. "It's disgusting, Dad. To think that anyone would see you, or anyone else, as less than human just because of the color of your skin. And what hurts even more is knowing that people like him thought they'd get away with it, that no one would care." Charlie sighed, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "This world, it still has a long way to go, Marcus. Men like Stark, they're comfortable with their hate. They pass it off as doing their job, or following procedure, and too many people look the other way." Marcus looked over at his father, his heart heavy with frustration. "I don't know how you do it, Dad, how you've put up with this kind of ugliness your whole life. I mean, after everything you've been through, after everything you've given, they still see you as less." Charlie's eyes hardened, his voice steady. "That's exactly why I don't back down, Marcus. Because if I let men like Stark make me feel small, if I let them dictate where I belong, then I'd be giving them exactly what they want. And I won't do that. Not after all the men I've served with, all the friends I've lost. They deserve better than that, and so do I." Marcus nodded slowly, his respect for his father growing with every word. "You're right, Dad. They do, and you do. I wish it didn't have to be this way. I wish you didn't have to keep fighting just to be treated like a person." Charlie's gaze softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You did your part today, son. You made sure that man faced consequences for his actions, and maybe, just maybe, It'll make someone else think twice before treating the next person like they don't belong. Marcus took a deep breath, letting his father's words sink in. I want to believe that, Dad. I want to believe that what happened today will make a difference. But I also know there are others out there, just like him, waiting to pull the same stunt. Charlie nodded solemnly. And that's why we keep standing up, Marcus. For every person out there who's ever felt unwelcome, for every man or woman who's ever been told they don't belong, we have to be the ones who show them that they do. The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling between them. The injustice, the frustration, the bittersweet victory, they all lingered in the cool night air. Finally, Charlie looked at his son, a faint smile breaking through his solemn expression. You did right by me, Marcus. Today, you showed the world that men like Stark won't be tolerated. And as long as there are people like you out there, maybe there's a chance things will change. Marcus returned the smile, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and determination. Thank you, Dad, for everything. For teaching me what it means to stand up, to show respect, and to never back down. Charlie nodded, his eyes filled with pride. Anytime, son, anytime. As they sat together, watching the stars above, Marcus knew that, while the fight was far from over, he was part of something bigger. And as long as his father's quiet strength guided him, he would continue to fight for justice, for dignity, and for respect, one day at a time.